Go into this for you guys to kind of see exactly everything that God really has for you in this lesson. So what we'll do is, if you haven't found your place already in John 11, pray that we quickly get there. I'm going to start reading there in verse 1. And we're going to, like I said, we're going to read quite a bit. We're going to go all the way to verse 44. And the only reason why is because there's so much that I want to pull out of that. So we'll start in verse 1. And it says, "Now a certain man was sick named Lazarus of where? Bethany, a town of Mary and her sister Martha. And we know from the Bible study that they lived together, that Lazarus and Mary and Martha all stayed in the same place, and Christ was staying with them. And verse 2 goes into what was going on. It says, "And it was that Mary," the Mary that it's talking about, "which anointed the Lord with oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick." So it's that Mary, his brother Lazarus, was sick. "Therefore his sister sent unto him, saying," or sent unto Christ, saying, "Lord, behold, whom thou lovest is sick." So they come to him and tell him this. Now he's a long way away, so it took him a while to get to him. All right, and verse 4 says, "When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby." And verse 5, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And when he heard, therefore, that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was." So I want you to see this. We're going to come back to that. We're going to mention that a few times. But when Christ found out that he was sick, he didn't take off right away. He stayed where he was, and he spent 2 more days there. And now it's a long journey back too, in addition to that. So then after that saith he to disciples, "Let us go into Judea again." And his disciples say unto him, "Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again?" And Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbleth, because there is no light in him." All right, so I want to break this down, because it's probably not going to make a lot of sense. So what he's talking about is, he has to go back. The disciples question him, they say, "Hey, when we were there last time, they tried to stone you. They tried to kill you there. And why are we going back? Why are you going back anyway?" And Christ says, "We have to." Now, if you look at what he said, "Is there not 12 hours in the day? If a man walks in the light, he's not going to stumble, but if he walks in the dark, he is." Why did he say that? Because Christ wasn't there. Who's the light? Who's the salt and the light of the world? So this place now was without Christ, without spiritual influence for a while. So the people there, what does God look at? He looks at the outsiders, right? No. He looks at our heart. So he already knew what was going over there. How do we know he already knew what was going on? Because when they came to him and said that Lazarus was sick, he said, "Oh, I know, but it's not a sickness unto death. He's okay." Christ already knew he was sick. And the amazing thing is, he knew the spiritual condition of the people there. And he said, they're walking in darkness now. They haven't had any spiritual light there to give them some light. We have to go back. And this is a good time to go back. Does that make sense? So that's why he said that. So if you look at that and you just read it, it's not going to make sense to you. You really got to kind of tear it down and really think about what he's saying. Because a lot of times you just think, oh, it's dark there, so they're stumbling around in the dark. No, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about spiritual darkness. Does that make sense? All right, and then in verse 11 he said, These things said he, and after that he saith unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may wake him out of sleep. So he says he's sleeping, he's going to go wake him up. Then his disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he shall do well. Let him sleep. If he's sick and he's sleeping, let him sleep, because that's what you need. What happens when you're sick? You need sleep, right? A lot of times they tell you, go home and get some rest. Then his disciples in verse 12 said unto him, Lord, if he sleeps, he do well. Verse 13 says, howbeit, or however, Jesus spake or was speaking. So, however, Jesus was speaking of his death. He was not speaking about Lazarus taking a nap here. He was actually speaking about his death. But they thought that he had spoken of a rest in sleep, or thought he was taking, he was just asleep. In verse 14, then Jesus said unto them plainly, Look, guys, Lazarus is dead. How can I make it any more clear to you? He's not sleeping. Thought maybe you'd get it, but he's dead. And now verse 15 says what? What's the first 3 words? Or first 4? And I am glad. Now, if you look online and look this up, a lot of pastors will stop there. They'll say, Lazarus is dead and I am glad. And they'll write sermons about it. That's not what Christ is saying. So don't get that twisted up. It says that Jesus said to them plainly, to the intent that you may believe. Jesus didn't say, Lazarus is dead and I'm glad he's dead. No, Lazarus is dead and I'm glad for your sakes I wasn't there when he died, because I have a miracle to perform that's going to change your mind. That is going to go for what? For the glory of God. We already saw that. And then he said, to the intent that you may believe, nevertheless, let us go unto him. Now this is amazing. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. And I'm going to cover why that's there later on. Verse 16, then said Thomas, which is also called Didymus, which we know that, obviously, unto his fellow disciples, let us go that we may die with him. Now this is incredible. Let us go that we may die with him. Why did he say that? Because he was a friend of Christ, right? But also, there's a twofold purpose, and this is, there's two different schools of theology on this. Some say that he meant, well, let's go back. We're going to die with him when we get back anyway, because they're going to stone us when we get there, because they tried to stone us before. That's what some people think. And then some other people think that because it was Lazarus and Christ was so close to him, that what this means is, let's go back there and spend the rest of our lives there with him and just die there and be buried along with Lazarus. So there's two different schools of theology. I kind of think it has to do with both. I think what it means is he was thinking, well, Christ is obviously a close friend of him, so we're going to go back, we're going to stay there, we're going to die there, and if they stone us, they stone us. If they don't, that's fine. But verse 17 says, then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. Here's the amazing part. When Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. Did he find out? No. He found that he had lain in the grave. He already knew. But when he got there, he found, because everybody was telling him, hey, he's already dead. He's been dead for 4 days. And all this kind of stuff. And he didn't find out. He just found that because that's what they had told him, and that's what everybody was bugging him about. We're going to see a little bit more about that in a little bit. Now, Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs off, verse 18 says. In verse 19, and many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary. So it's a pretty good distance off. It's pretty close, but it's not, right up against it. So many of the Jews that came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. So they all traveled over there, because that was customary, right? What do we do when someone passes, right? If it's a close friend, we go and we comfort them, right? We do everything we can to comfort them. That's exactly what they were doing. All right, and then verse 20. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary sat still in the house. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. Did Christ need to be there? I don't think so. But I know that even now whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. And Jesus saith unto her in verse 23, thy brother shall rise. In verse 24, Martha still doesn't understand what he's saying. And she says, Martha saith unto him, verse 24, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection of the last day. And in verse 25, Jesus answered her back and said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. So Christ answers her back and says, hey, I am the resurrection and life. If you believe in me, you will be raised again. And in verse 26, and whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this? So Christ asked her that. She said unto him, yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into this world. And when she had so said, she went her way and called Mary, her sister, secretly saying, the Master is come and calleth for thee. Now, what happened here? Christ, notice what's going on. She was coming, running up to Christ and said, if you would have been here, everything would have been okay. Christ said, I'm the resurrection and life. He that believes in me, that even if they were dead, they're going to live. Right? And he asked her, do you understand that? He's not dead. It's not over for him. It's not his time. And she said she understood. We're going to see something here in a little bit after that. So then she goes and tells Mary, secretly, and says that Christ was calling for her. So verse 29. And as soon as she heard, she arose quickly and came unto him. Now Jesus was not yet come into the town called Bethany, but was. And then it says, verse 31, the Jews that were with her, which is Mary, in the house, and was comforting her, when they saw Mary, that she rose up hastily and out, followed her, saying, she goeth unto the grave to weep there. So they didn't know where she was going. They just saw her jump up and take off out of the house. So they took off with her, and they were thinking that she was going to the grave to weep over Lazarus there. Then when Mary was come to where Jesus was, she saw him. She fell at his feet, saying unto him, now what did she say? Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. Now this is amazing, because she says the same thing. If you had been here, he wouldn't have died. When Jesus saw therefore her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in the spirit, and was troubled, and said, Where have you laid him? And they said unto him, Lord, come and see. When they said this to him, he actually groaned in his spirit. He was like, I can just imagine, he was probably thinking, where is your faith? Where is your faith? And instead of even just speaking it, because usually that's what he does, right? Usually what does he say? Oh, ye of little faith. But instead at this point he just said, come on, you guys know this stuff. Come on, you should know this. And then he just said unto them, like I said in verse 34, where have you laid him? And they said unto him, Lord, come and see. And verse 35 is the shortest verse in the Bible. If you don't know it, mark it down. Jesus wept. So John 11:35 is the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Wow. Yeah, no, can you imagine? Can you imagine this way? Actually, Christ actually wept. And actually was, he groans in his spirit and then he weeps over just, to be honest with you, did he cry when he found out that Lazarus was dead? No. He cried and he groaned in his spirit over the spiritual condition of the people that should know by now. This is stuff they should know. Verse 36 says, Then said the Jews, Behold how he loved him. And some of them said, Could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Let me ask you that. Could not Christ, which opened the eyes of the blind, have caused even that this man should not have died? Absolutely. He could have. We know it. Think that for yourself for a second. Let that soak in. Jesus therefore again groaning in himself, cometh to the grave. And it was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. And Jesus said, Take the stone away. Now, what did Martha say before when Christ said, I am the resurrection and life, believe thou what I say? She said, Oh, I believe. Does she believe? Because it says in verse 39, Jesus said, Take the stone away. Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead for 4 days. And Jesus said unto her, Said I not unto thee that if thou wouldst believe, thou shouldst see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and I know that thou hearest me always. If we could only get that in ourselves. Listen to what Christ said. I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and I know that thou always hearest me. But because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. And when he thus spoke, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. And Jesus said unto them, Loose him and let him go. Listen. That's where we're going to stop. Listen to this. Think about the scriptures we just covered. Sometimes we have to go through a little rough water to refine and purify our faith. We've talked about this a few times before, but what would happen, seriously, stop and consider this and think about this, if you had the perfect road and everything was laid ahead of you and you were just walking on pavement all day long? There was no dips and no valleys, no ups and no downs. What would your faith be like? So it's incredible. So sometimes we have to go through a little bit of rough water and a little bit of trying to refine and improve our faith. Now, think about this. Could Christ have healed Lazarus right there on the spot when they first showed up? Absolutely he could. And how do we know that? Because scriptures tell us many times he did. Think about a time when a century came that was a guard and he had a son that was sick, or a servant that was sick. There was another one too, where a servant was, there was another one. There was several times where they would come to him and say, hey, so-and-so is sick, or this and that and the other thing, and Christ would just say, he's healed. Don't even worry about it. Just go your way. And there was times where they would say, I'm a busy man. If I say unto my servants under me, go, and they go, and come, and they come, then I know that if you will tell them that, that if you will say that they can be healed, that they will be healed, because of their faith they were healed. So there was many times. Matthew 8, 5 through 13 is just one example. I could have gave you tons of scriptures. As I was going through this, I started looking up some of them, and I was just like, wow, I would be here all day if I listed them all. Of all the times that Christ healed people without ever going. And it's amazing because Christ could have, right then and there, when they first got to him, he could have healed them on the spot. But like I said, then what would happen? Then people would start to lose their faith, right? They don't need it. They don't need it anymore. Christ just all we got to do is just heal it all right away. And then there's no problems, and there's nothing to keep you closer to God, right? The second thing I wanted to show you is Christ already knew the situation and the solution before the problem ever occurred. How do we know that? Look at verse 4. It's amazing what verse 4 says because it tells you a lot. When Jesus heard that he was sick and that he wasn't doing well, he said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby." So look what Christ does. When they come to him and they say, "Hey, Lazarus is sick," obviously he must have been really sick, right? Because in order for them to run all the way to Christ, where Christ was, he must have been pretty sick. So they run all the way to where Christ is and says, "Hey, here's the deal. Lazarus is in his bed and he's not able to get up. He's really, really sick. There's a really bad problem. I think you should come." And what did Christ say? What did he say? It's no big deal. It's not unto death. It's okay, right? That's what he says. Look at verse 4. He says, "This sickness is not unto death." So he already knew. He was sick before they even got there. And he told them what was going to happen. He said, it's not a sickness unto death. He's going to be okay. But it goes even a step further. He says, Lazarus will be okay, and God will be glorified. God is going to receive the glory out of this situation, right? So the amazing thing that we see is God, first off, knew the situation because as soon as they got there, he said, "Don't even worry about it. It's not a sickness unto death." So that proves he knew the circumstance. And then he already knew the solution. How did he know the solution? Because he said it's not going to be a problem. But then he also made a very awesome statement. Probably one of the most incredible statements you're going to see. And that is that God will be glorified hereby. Isn't that amazing? So through this whole circumstance, what was going on? The whole circumstance really didn't have anything to do with Lazarus, did it? The whole circumstance didn't have anything to do with anything else except for bringing God the glory. And why did he stay for an extra couple of days? Why did he stay there for an extra couple of days instead of taking off right away? For the same reason, to bring God the glory. So he stays for a couple extra days so that they can see God's glory. So many times we think in our lives that it's all about who? Us. We get our eyes on the wrong place. We think that it's all about us. And when something doesn't go our way, we think, "Oh, God let me down again. God just let me down. My so-and-so just died," or this or that or the other thing. Now that's not fun to go through those kinds of situations. And I think all of us have probably been there a time or two. And if not, at some point you're going to go through it where you lose a loved one. It's not a great time. But at the same time, instead of thinking about us, what should we start to think about? God, what are you trying to show me? Is it because I need to learn a lesson? Or is it because you just want to take them home where they don't have to feel this pain anymore? What's the purpose? I know for my parents, I can only imagine how awesome and how incredible it must have been to be relieved of this world. And to be out of the pain and everything they were going through. So sometimes we just need to understand why we're going through the mess we're going through. Sometimes, we think, "God, why would you, allow this to happen? If only you would have showed up before, I wouldn't be in this mess." What did we learn last week? What is God? He's right there, imminent. Right there with you. When we think he's not there, he's right there beside you. He sees everything that goes on. The scriptures told us last week, we saw several places where it said that he sees everything. He's everywhere. The heavens are filled with him. The earth is filled with him. There's nothing that he does not see. So if there's nothing he doesn't see, then that means he's everywhere and he sees everything, correct? That's the only thing we can draw purpose. And then it may not be one that we understand, but he is working out a better purpose. So, the whole point of that, and the big thing I want to tell you guys and really get across to us is, how do we feel it's our position to shake an earthly finger at a sovereign, heavenly God? That's what we do. When we get in these situations, it's so easy for us to shake an earthly finger at a sovereign God that knows everything he's doing. He knew you before you were born. He knew you before you were born, and you and you. He knows us all before we even born, and he knows every hair on our head. Scriptures tell us that. He knows you so well. And sometimes what he does is, when we get so much into looking at what's on the outside of our body and what's going on the outside and thinking, oh, they're doing this and they're doing that and so, and did you hear? And they got a new car, they must be dealing drugs because there's no way they can afford that, right? And so we start, naming all these things that everybody else should have done or is doing, instead of focusing on what? Bringing God the glory. We need to just stop looking at what everybody else is doing and stop thinking about everything else that's going on around us. And what we really need to do is just get focused on one thing, and that is God. Because through death, through life, through principalities and powers and anything else in the scripture you can look up, God has his hand right into everything. And if you really look at what life is, it's just Play-Doh. And God's just sitting there molding it. And even when you think that he doesn't have control of the situation, he does. And when you feel like he just took the Play-Doh like this, there's probably a reason. There might be a reason that's just a little bit bigger than what we can see. There's an amazing scripture that goes along with this. Christ knows more about your situation than we do. He knows the best outcome. How do we know that? Isaiah 55, verses 8 through 9. Who knows these scriptures? If you don't commit them to memory. For my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So when we think that we understand everything, and we've got it all wrapped in our little bubble of our own human abilities and our own human minds and all this kind of stuff, we need to stop doing these kinds of things and just start to let go. And I know it's hard. Tisha can tell you I struggle sometimes with certain things, with letting go and just trusting God. But, every day it's another lesson, and I start learning and I get stronger every single day. I think we all should. Who was a very strong Christian? Paul? And what did he struggle with all the time? And he constantly was growing and growing. We'll never ever reach full Christian maturity, because that's impossible until we get to heaven. And even then, we're still going to be, obviously, we're never going to be as far as on our mental capabilities as God is. All right, and the third point, and I kind of hinted to this before, but it's all about God and not about us. It's all about God and not about us. Listen to this, because this is so incredible. Christ knew that a little town called Bethany needed a little light. Christ knew. Christ knew that there was a little town called Bethany that needed a little faith lesson. When they came running up to him, he knew already. He knew they were coming before they got to him. And when they got to him, they said, oh, we got this big situation and all this going on. And Christ is like, yeah, I know. But the cool thing is, it's not until death. Now, did he die? He sure did. He died. And he spent 4 days in the grave. But there's someone just a little bit bigger than death itself. A little bit. Death itself and all these things that we see and we think are so big or so small when you pile it up next to God. So when they came to him, Christ knew already. He knew that a little town called Bethany needed a light. He knew that they had been stumbling around in darkness. He told them that. He knew that they were stumbling around in darkness. They needed a little lesson in faith. He could have healed Lazarus just by saying, hey, Lazarus, by the way, get out of the grave from where I am. You just come forward. Now, here's what Christ could have done. He could have said, hey, yo, dead guy, come forward. And what would have happened? Every dead person in the world would have stepped up and walked out of the grave. He called Lazarus, come Lazarus came out. It's amazing because I truly believe that if Christ would have just said, hey, come forth out of the grave, all the graves would have split wide open and they would all came out. But he said, Lazarus, come forth. And a person that was dead for 4 days came stumbling out of the grave. Imagine the power of that. If you can do that, well, I'd be the best friend. But the amazing thing is we can't do that. There is only one that can, and that is God. And God called him forth out of the grave. You poor Richie from time to time might need a little bit of light. Newport Richie just might need a little lesson in faith. The McFarland family may need a lesson in faith. Whatever. Sometimes the water gets a little choppy for a reason. Why? So we remember who God is. Sometimes all he wants to do is just say, hey, ding, 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 remember me? I'm over here. You know, we get all caught up in our situation and he says, okay, you got all caught up in your situation. It's all about you now. You're living in darkness. You're stumbling around without the lights on and you're just falling all over the place. If I took everybody and blindfolded them and stuck them on this wall and said, get to the other wall, it'd be a little tricky, right? With all these chairs and everything in here. Before you know it, you hear chairs everywhere. You hear people falling into each other and everything else. And the real reason is because we sometimes get caught up in our own situations and what we think is right. And so sometimes what God has to do is he has to send a little light. Sometimes he has to take us through a little bit of tough water, a little bit of hard times, so that we just don't get too far away from God. You know, another pastor, who was it that was on that did this work on today that I thought was so funny? I don't remember. I watched a sermon the other day though, and this pastor was sitting there and he was talking. I thought it was incredible. I was like, I should do that at our church. It'd be so much fun. And he had this little squirt gun, and it was really cool. And he was talking about pressures of our life. And he was talking about how the pressure affects us. And he gets this little tiny squirt gun from this guy, and the guy gives him the squirt gun. And he stands out there and he's like, and he's squirting everybody. And he says, see, when I press this little button, I put a little bit of pressure on, and the water squirts out and gets you. You know? And he said, isn't that cool? And they were all like kind of laughing, and they all thought it was funny, especially the ones in the back that he couldn't get with the little squirt gun. And finally he's like, hey, come here, give me that one. He gets this big squirt gun. He's like, and I mean, he's pumping on it. He's like, the more I press this, and the more pressure I put into this chamber, what happens? I can reach you back there. And he starts squirting them. He's squirting all the way now. It's reaching the people in the back. He said the more pressure sometimes that you have on your life, the better your effectiveness is. It's so incredible that he said that. Because it's so true. Sometimes God has to crank down the pressure a little bit to get you to be a little bit more effective. Sometimes he needs to crank down the pressure for us to understand what it's all about. And to get our eyes off of what's going on around us and to get focused back on what's really life is all about. Really, in all reality, there's only one thing we need to be focused on. And what is that? Our relationship with God. And what we really need to be worried about is bringing the glory back to God.